My name is Marissa Bennett. I was 39 that Sunday, sitting at my parents' house for another family dinner I already knew I would have to get through carefully. My mother, Judith, had barely finished serving the food when she lifted her glass and smiled at everyone around the table. Before we eat, I want to make a toast. She looked across the table at my older sister, Natalie. To Natalie, who has always known exactly where she was going and never seemed afraid to go after it, everyone smiled, and Mom continued. She has built a life she can be proud of, a career, a future, everything a mother hopes for. Then she turned toward me. And then there's Marissa, still figuring things out, I suppose. A few people laughed. I forced a small smile and reached for my glass, but I didn't say anything. I had heard versions of that speech my entire life. What caught my attention wasn't what my mother said. It was Natalie. She wasn't smiling. Her eyes dropped to the table, and when she finally looked at me, there was something in her expression I had never seen before. Fear. Mom kept talking about Natalie's career, her plans, and how proud she was of the daughter who had made something of herself. Natalie finally interrupted. Mom, that's enough. The room went quiet for a second. My mother laughed it off, but Natalie didn't. She looked at me again, then quickly looked away. I didn't know the whole story yet, but I knew something was wrong. And whatever Natalie was hiding had something to do with the way my mother had just praised her. If you've ever felt like the daughter who was never quite enough for her family, I'd love to know where you're watching from, what time it is there right now, and whether it's raining where you are. Tell me your story in the comments, and then let's get back to mine. The next morning, I went to work before I had decided whether I was angry or simply tired. I answered emails, joined a meeting, and spent most of the morning pretending I wasn't thinking about dinner. By lunch, I had already replayed one moment in my head several times, not my mother's toast, but the way Natalie had looked at me when Mom was talking about her career. My mother had been comparing us for as long as I could remember. When I was 17, I won a regional writing competition at school. My English teacher called my parents and told them I had a real talent for it. Mom thanked her, congratulated me, and then asked whether Natalie had heard back about a college program she wanted. The conversation moved on before I could even finish telling them what the award meant to me. A few months later, Natalie received an acceptance letter from a university. Mom called relatives, ordered a cake, and spent the entire evening talking about how proud she was. I remember sitting beside her while she showed everyone the letter for the third time. I wasn't angry with Natalie. I was angry that my good news always seemed smaller when hers was in the room. That pattern followed us into adulthood. Natalie became the daughter Mom mentioned whenever someone asked how the family was doing. She had the better job, the nicer office, and the kind of career my mother could explain to other people without having to add any details. My father, Gerald, rarely challenged her. He wasn't cruel, he simply avoided conflict whenever he could. Once, when I was in my 20s, I asked him why Mom always seemed disappointed in me. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You know your mother." That was his way of ending difficult conversations, and I learned not to ask twice. I built my own life anyway. I found work I was good at, bought a house, and married Derek, who never treated my career like something I had to defend. We weren't wealthy, but our bills were paid, our savings were growing, and I didn't need my parents to support me. By 39, I had stopped expecting my mother to see my life the way I saw it. I had a steady career, a mortgage I could manage, and a marriage that felt like a partnership instead of another performance I had to pass. Derek knew when I needed advice and when I simply needed him to listen. He also knew that calls from my mother could change my mood before I even realized it. My parents were doing fine on their own, at least most of the time. They had their house, retirement income, and the ordinary expenses. Still, whenever an unexpected bill came up, I was usually the first person they called. Sometimes it was a plumbing problem. Sometimes it was a car repair or a medical bill they said had caught them off guard. I paid what I could and moved on. I never told Natalie about every payment. I wasn't trying to compete with her, and I didn't want another family conversation about who contributed more. If Mom needed something, I handled it. If Dad called, I answered. It was easier that way, but there was another reason I kept helping. Every time I did, my mother became a little less critical. Not warmer, exactly, but quieter. The questions about my career stopped for a while. The comparisons became less frequent. I had never said this out loud, even to Derek, but part of me had started to believe that being useful was the closest thing I would ever get to being appreciated by my mother. That was why I couldn't stop thinking about Natalie after dinner. Her reaction hadn't looked like embarrassment. It had looked like someone trying to keep a secret from becoming visible. I wanted to ask her directly, but I knew how quickly a question could become a family argument, so I decided to wait until I had something more than a feeling. I went through the rest of my evening normally. Derek made dinner, we talked about work, and I answered a few messages before putting my phone down. I was almost ready for bed when it buzzed again. The message was from someone I hadn't spoken to in several weeks. Colleen Hayes had written only one sentence. "Can we meet after work?" I read it twice, then looked at the time. 2 days later, Colleen Hayes was waiting for me at a coffee shop near my office. I recognized her immediately from the message she had sent, though we had only met a few times over the years. She had worked in the same industry as Natalie, and had crossed paths with her professionally, which was why I hadn't been surprised when she said she knew something about Natalie's job. What surprised me was the question she asked before she even ordered her coffee. "Does your sister still work at Belmont?" I frowned. "Of course she does. Why?" Colleen looked at me carefully. "I thought you knew she left." For a moment, I honestly thought she had the wrong person. Natalie didn't leave. My mother was talking about her career on Sunday. Colleen didn't argue. She simply pulled her phone from her bag and showed me a message from someone who still worked at the company. It wasn't gossip. It was a routine work update that mentioned Natalie had left several months earlier. I read it twice, then checked the company's public staff directory myself. Natalie's name was gone. I opened her professional profile and found the same thing. Her last position had ended months before the dinner at my parents' house. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Yes," Colleen said. "That's why I thought you might know about it." I didn't tell her what Mom had said at dinner. I just stared at the screen and tried to understand why my mother would still describe Natalie as someone with a thriving career if she knew that wasn't true. Losing a job was serious, but it wasn't a crime, and it wasn't something a family needed to hide forever. Natalie could have been between jobs. She could have taken time off. There were plenty of ordinary explanations, but the more I thought about Sunday night, the less ordinary it felt. Natalie hadn't looked embarrassed when Mom praised her. She had looked nervous. Colleen lowered her voice. "Marissa, I don't think the job is the part you need to worry about." I looked up at her. "Then what is?" She hesitated before answering. "I think your family has been covering something for her." My stomach tightened. "What?" Colleen shook her head. "I don't know everything, and I don't want to pretend I do. I only know what I've heard through work." She paused, then added that Natalie's situation was more serious than simply leaving a company. I asked whether Natalie was in trouble, but Colleen wouldn't speculate. She only told me that several people had noticed changes long before I had. That was all she was willing to say. I asked Colleen one more question before we left. "Why did you tell me this?" She folded her hands around her cup and said, "Because I didn't realize you were her sister until recently. Once I did, I figured someone should tell you what I actually knew instead of letting you hear it from somebody who was guessing." That answer mattered to me. Colleen wasn't claiming to know Natalie's entire life. She wasn't asking me to believe a rumor. She had one piece of information, and she had given it to me because she thought I deserved to know. I appreciated that. Before we separated, she told me she would send me the name of the person who had confirmed Natalie's departure if I wanted to verify it myself. I told her I would. On the way back to the office, I received the contact information and checked it during my lunch break. The answer didn't change. Natalie had left months earlier. There was no mistake. What bothered me most was how easily my mother had spoken about her career. She hadn't sounded uncertain. She had sounded proud, confident, and completely sure that nobody at the table would question her. I returned to work and finished the afternoon without telling anyone what I had learned. When I got home that evening, Derek asked how my meeting had gone. I told him I had learned something about Natalie, but I didn't give him the details yet. He didn't push. He knew I needed to sort through it myself. Later, I opened my phone and looked at the family group chat. There were dozens of ordinary messages, but nothing about Natalie's job. Not one. I searched older conversations and found the same pattern. Whenever someone asked about Natalie, Mom gave the same confident answer. She was busy. She was doing well. She had big things coming. None of those messages matched what I now knew. I put my phone down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only found the first piece of a much larger story. That evening, I stopped trying to guess what my mother was hiding and started checking dates. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and went back through everything I had learned since meeting Colleen. Natalie had left her job months earlier. That part was certain. What I didn't know was what happened afterward. I searched for recent information about her work, but there was nothing suggesting she had started somewhere else. Her professional profile was unchanged, and there were no new announcements. I checked a few old messages from my mother too. She had mentioned Natalie being busy several times during the past few months, but never once said she was looking for work. I opened a separate tab and started looking at the dates of those messages. They lined up almost perfectly with the period after Natalie left her company. That was when another possibility occurred to me. Maybe Natalie wasn't simply between jobs. Maybe she was struggling financially. I didn't want to assume that, so I called my father. He answered on the fourth ring. "Hey, Dad, is Natalie okay?" There was a pause. It wasn't long, but it was long enough for me to notice. "She's fine," he said. "Just dealing with some changes." "What kind of changes?" Another pause. "Nothing you need to worry about." I leaned back in my chair. "Did she find another job?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Your sister will figure things out." I knew my father well enough to recognize what he was doing. He wasn't lying to me. He was avoiding the question because he didn't want to give me an answer. "Does Mom know what's going on?" I asked. This time, he sighed. "Your mother knows more than I do." That answer told me more than he probably intended. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat there for a few seconds, staring at my phone. Dad knew. Mom knew. And neither of them had thought I deserved to know. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, the secret itself or how naturally they had kept me outside of it. I tried to put the thought aside and focus on something I could actually verify. I opened my bank account. Over the years, I had sent my parents money whenever they needed help. I never kept a detailed mental record because the payments were usually ordinary. A broken appliance, a repair, an unexpected bill. Sometimes I sent money without asking many questions because I trusted them. I started scrolling through the transaction history, looking for payments to my parents. Most of them were exactly what I remembered. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One payment had a different pattern. It wasn't going to either of my parents. It appeared under a separate recipient, and the same recipient showed up again a few weeks later. I clicked on the transaction details. The name appeared on the screen. Natalie Bennett. I froze for a moment. I needed time to understand it. I checked the date. Then I opened another transaction. The same name appeared again. I went back through the previous months and found another payment. Then another. I simply stared at the screen, trying to understand why my sister's name was appearing in my own financial history. I had sent money to my parents because I believed I was helping them. I had never knowingly sent money to Natalie. I closed the account, opened it again, and searched the older transactions one more time. Her name was still there. I checked the payment descriptions next. Some were blank, while others had short notes that meant nothing to me at the time. I compared the dates with the transfers I had made to my parents and noticed that several of the payments to Natalie came shortly after my own deposits. Still, the pattern was enough to make me uncomfortable. I took a screenshot of the transactions and saved the statements to a folder on my computer. Then I went back to the family group chat and searched for the months when those payments appeared. Mom had been sending cheerful messages about Natalie during that same period. She talked about how hard she was working and how excited she was about what came next. Dad had barely said anything. That silence now felt different. I looked at the transaction list again and noticed one more detail. The payments to Natalie weren't random, they were recurring. I had found the first one, then another after that. I still didn't know how much money was involved, who had arranged the transfers, or whether Natalie even knew where the money came from. I only knew that her name had appeared in a place where I had never expected to see it. I wrote down the dates on a sheet of paper and placed it beside my laptop. Then I opened the oldest statement I could access. There were more transactions waiting for me there. The following morning, I went through every payment again. I started with the oldest statement I could access and worked forward month by month, matching each transfer to the reason I had been given at the time. Most payments were easy to identify. There was a plumbing repair, a replacement appliance, a car expense, and a few smaller amounts I barely remembered. Then I started comparing those payments with the transactions that carried Natalie's name. The first one was easy to dismiss. It could have been a mistake. The second made me pause. By the third, I stopped calling it a coincidence. The payments to Natalie were spread across several months, and they appeared often enough to form a pattern. I wrote down the date, amount, and recipient of every transaction I could find. Then I placed those dates beside the transfers I had made to my parents. Several of them were close together. I couldn't prove yet that one payment caused the other, but the timing was difficult to ignore. I went back even further. There were more. Some had been sent directly after I had helped my parents with a larger expense. Others appeared weeks later. None of the descriptions said why the money had moved. I opened each transaction and checked the details again. The recipient was still Natalie Bennett. I had never knowingly authorized money for my sister. I kept going until I had a list covering nearly a year. Then I finally added the amounts together. The number on my calculator made me stop. It wasn't one emergency payment. It wasn't even a few favors spread across a difficult season. It was a substantial amount of money that had left my account over time and ended up with my sister. I sat there thinking about every time my mother had told me I needed to be more responsible. "You need to be more responsible," she had said more than once, usually when she thought I was spending too much or making the wrong decision. I had accepted those comments because I assumed she was worried about me. Now I was looking at my own records and seeing money I had earned being used somewhere else without my knowledge. What bothered me most was not that Natalie needed help. If my sister had called me and told me she was struggling, I would have listened. I might even have helped. What I couldn't accept was being told one story while my money was quietly supporting another. I didn't call Mom. I didn't text Natalie. I didn't tell Derek everything yet. Before I did anything, I wanted to understand exactly what I had been paying and whether I had any obligation to keep doing it. The next afternoon, I met Marcus Reed, a financial advisor I had used once before for a basic question about my accounts. I showed him the statements and explained only the financial side of the situation. Marcus went through the transactions carefully. He confirmed that the money I had been sending my parents was voluntary support. There was no agreement requiring me to continue making those payments, and stopping future transfers would not mean taking back anything I had already given. "If you stop the payments going forward, you're simply choosing not to make new gifts," he told me. "You're not reversing the old ones." I asked whether there was any reason I should contact my parents before stopping them. He shook his head. "That's your decision. Financially, you don't have to give advance notice." That answer settled something in me. I didn't need another argument. I didn't need to accuse anyone before I knew what they would say. I could simply stop. That evening, I opened my banking app and looked at the scheduled transfer for the next morning. It was the same routine payment I had made month after month. For years, I had clicked the button without thinking twice. This time, I looked at the amount, checked the recipient, and canceled the transfer. Then I closed the app. For the first time, I had chosen not to send the money. I sat for a few minutes before opening the statements again. I wanted to make sure I had not misunderstood anything, so I checked the recurring dates one last time. The same recipient appeared often enough that I could no longer explain it as an isolated mistake. I also noticed that the payments were not all the same amount. Some were small, some were larger, and several had no description at all. That made the situation harder to interpret, not easier. I didn't know whether my mother had arranged every transfer herself, whether my father had been involved, or whether Natalie knew where the money came from. I wasn't going to invent answers just because I was angry. I saved the records, closed the file, and left the rest for another day. The only decision I had made was about my own account. I was no longer going to send another payment until I understood the truth. I knew that choice would have consequences, but I wasn't ready to discuss them with anyone. For now, I wanted the records to speak for themselves. I printed the statements, placed them in a folder, and put the folder in my desk drawer. Then I checked the banking app once more. The canceled transfer was gone from the schedule. Nothing else had changed. I hadn't confronted my mother, questioned Natalie, or told anyone outside my home. The next move belonged to them, not me. I turned off the light and went to bed without sending another message. I left it there quietly. The first call came before breakfast the next morning. My mother did not say hello for long. She went straight to the question. Why didn't the transfer go through? I knew exactly which transfer she meant, but I kept my voice neutral. I decided not to send it this month. There was a pause. You decided? Mom repeated the words as if I had made an unreasonable business decision instead of a personal one. Yes, Marissa, we were counting on that money. I looked at the folder of statements on my desk. I'm sure you were. She immediately brought up everything she had done for me over the years. After everything we've done for you, I don't think this is fair. I listened without interrupting. She never asked why I had stopped. She didn't ask whether something had happened. She wanted the payment restored. When the call ended, I left my phone on the counter and tried to continue with my morning. Less than an hour later, Dad called. His tone was completely different. He wasn't angry. He sounded tired. Your mother says you're not sending the usual money. That's right. Can you reconsider? I leaned against the kitchen counter. Why should I? He was quiet. Because things are difficult right now. I waited for him to explain, but he didn't. For you and Mom? I asked. For the family, he said. That answer bothered me more than it should have. He still wouldn't say what the money was actually needed for. Dad, if there's something I need to know, just tell me. He sighed. I don't want to get in the middle of this. You already are. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he asked me to think about what I was doing and promised Mom would call later. After we hung up, I sat at the table and stared at the folder again. I had expected them to notice the missing payment. I hadn't expected them to treat it like something I had failed to deliver. By lunchtime, Natalie had texted me. Her message was shorter than I expected. Mom told me you stopped helping. I read it twice before replying. I stopped one payment. A few minutes passed. Then she wrote, I know, I just don't know what I'm supposed to do now. There was no accusation in her message. No anger, just fear. I asked, why does this affect you? She didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, she said, things have been hard since I left work. I stared at the screen. She had admitted more in one sentence than my parents had told me in weeks. Still, I didn't mention the transfers. I didn't ask whether she knew about them. Why didn't you tell me? I wrote. Her reply came several minutes later. Mom said you had enough going on. That answer stayed with me. It sounded reasonable until I remembered the dinner, the toast, and the way Mom had described Natalie as if nothing in her life had changed. I put my phone down and returned to work, but the calls started again that afternoon. Mom wanted to talk. I let the first call go to voicemail. When she called again, I answered. You can't just make a decision like this without thinking about your family, she said. I have thought about my family. Then you should understand that Natalie needs help. Why is that my responsibility? Mom's voice sharpened. Because she's your sister. Being her sister doesn't mean I have to pay for her. There was silence on the other end. Then Mom said, you don't understand what she's dealing with. Then tell me. She didn't. Instead, she reminded me that family members were supposed to step up when someone was struggling. I asked whether she had been telling Natalie to depend on me. Mom denied it. No one is depending on you. We're just asking you to do what you've always done. That sentence finally made the situation clear. They didn't see my help as generosity anymore. They saw it as part of the family's normal structure, something I was expected to keep providing. I ended the call without agreeing to anything. I didn't want the conversation to happen over the phone. Every time I asked a direct question, someone found a way around it, and I was done filling in the missing pieces for them. Mom said she would come with Dad. I agreed and gave her a time. Before hanging up, she asked whether Derek would be there. Yes, I said. Why? She hesitated. Because this is a family matter. I almost laughed. Then you shouldn't mind having another family member in the room. She didn't answer. After the call ended, I received another message from Natalie. Are they coming to your house? I told her they were. She didn't respond for several minutes. Then she wrote, I think I should be there too. I looked at the message and realized Sunday was no longer going to be a conversation about one missed payment. Everyone who had been involved had a reason to be there, even if they weren't ready to admit what that reason was. I put my phone away and finished the work I had left for the afternoon. I would wait until Sunday to hear the rest. A few minutes later, Mom called again. This time, her voice was less controlled. Natalie can't lose this right now. I sat up straight. Lose what? She stopped speaking. I waited. Mom, what can't Natalie lose? Nothing. Then she said, "We need to talk." I looked at the calendar on my desk. Fine. Then come to my house Sunday. Sunday afternoon, my parents pulled into our driveway. Derek was already home, and I had spent the morning making sure the records were organized in front of me. I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted answers. Judith walked in first, with Gerald behind her. Neither of them mentioned the money until we sat down. "I can't believe you would do this to your sister." I kept my hands folded. "Do what?" "Cut her off when she's already struggling." Her voice carried the same certainty it always did when she believed she was protecting Natalie. "You're hurting your sister." I didn't argue. I reached for the folder on the table and opened it. "Then let's talk about why." I placed the first statement in front of her. The page showed the date, the amount, and the recipient. "This is one payment." I placed another beside it. "This is another, then another, and this one." Judith glanced down at the papers, then back at me. "Those were family expenses." "Some of them were," I said, "but these were sent to Natalie." She shook her head. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." She picked up one of the statements and studied it. "Natalie needed help." "I understand that. What I don't understand is why I was told my money was going toward expenses for you and Dad." Mom put the paper down. "We never said every dollar stayed in our account. You didn't say it was going to Natalie either." Her expression tightened. She was in a difficult position. "For how long?" She didn't answer. I pointed to the dates. "These payments started months ago. They continued after she left her job. They happened again and again. Gerald had barely spoken since he arrived." I turned toward him. "Did you know?" He looked at Mom first. She didn't look back. Then he looked down at the table. "Yes." The word was quiet, but it changed the room. I stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded once. "I knew some of it." "And you never thought I should know?" "I thought your mother was handling it." I felt something in me go still. That was the same answer I had been given in different forms my entire life. "Let Mom handle it. Don't make things harder. Keep the peace." I looked back at Judith. "Did you tell Natalie I would keep paying?" "I told her we'd help her until she got back on her feet." "With my money?" Mom's eyes narrowed. "With family money." I almost laughed. But I didn't. It wasn't family money. It came from my account. Judith pushed the folder away. "You're making this sound much worse than it is, because you don't want to call it what it is. What do you want me to call it?" "I want you to tell me the truth." Before she could answer, the doorbell rang. Everyone stopped. Gerald looked toward the hallway. Mom's face changed. Derek stood up and went to the door. A moment later, Natalie walked into the room. She looked at me, then at the papers spread across the table. Her expression changed immediately. "What's going on?" she asked. No one answered. She took another step forward and saw her name on the statements. "Marissa." I didn't say anything. Natalie looked at Mom. "You said this was handled." Judith stood up. "Natalie, don't." But Natalie was already looking at me. "Mom said you wouldn't stop helping." The room went silent. I looked at Judith. She shook her head. "That's not what I meant." Natalie frowned. "You told me Marissa would keep helping until I found something." I finally understood why she had been so uncomfortable at dinner. She hadn't been afraid of me. She had been afraid that the truth would reach me. I looked at Natalie. "Did you know the money was coming from me?" She hesitated. "I knew Mom was using money to help me. I didn't know how much came from you." That distinction mattered, but it didn't erase what had happened. Judith stepped forward. "We're family." I looked at her. "Exactly. That's why I should have been told the truth." Mom tried to speak again, but I stopped her. "You don't have to explain your life to me, but I don't have to finance it." Natalie looked down. Gerald said nothing. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward myself. "The money stops here." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Judith looked at Gerald as if expecting him to intervene, but he stayed where he was. Natalie pulled out a chair and sat down, staring at the statements without touching them. "I should have told you," she said quietly. "Maybe you should have," I answered, "but Mom made that decision for everyone." Judith's face hardened. "I was trying to protect her." "I know," I said, "but protecting Natalie didn't require lying to me." She opened her mouth, then stopped. Derek remained silent beside me. He didn't need to speak. The records were already saying enough. Natalie looked at me again. I never asked Mom to hide it from you. Maybe not, I said. But you accepted the help. She nodded. I did. That was the first completely honest answer anyone had given me that afternoon. I gathered the statements into one stack. I wasn't interested in humiliating Natalie, and I wasn't going to make her failure the point of the conversation. The point was that my choice had been taken away from me. If I had known the truth, I could have decided whether to help. Instead, everyone had decided for me. Judith finally sat back down. So what happens now? She asked. I looked at her. Now you figure out your finances without assuming I'll cover the gap. She stared at me, but I didn't change my answer. The decision was already made. Nobody had anything else to say. The records remained between us, and for once, I wasn't the person trying to make everyone comfortable. I gathered the papers and kept them with me. For once, silence did not mean I had failed to keep the family together. It meant nobody could avoid the truth anymore. The following weeks were quieter than I expected. My mother stopped calling, and the messages that came through the family group became ordinary again. My parents still had their house, their retirement income, and the savings they had built over the years. They were not suddenly in danger. They simply had to adjust their spending without the extra money I had been providing. Dad cut back on a few things. Mom became more careful with purchases, and neither of them asked me for another transfer. Natalie had to make her own adjustments too. She continued looking for work, reduced her expenses, and started dealing with the debt she had accumulated while she was unemployed. She didn't ask me for money. That mattered more than I expected. We were not suddenly close, but she no longer treated my help as something guaranteed. A few weeks later, Gerald called and asked if we could meet alone. We sat at a small coffee shop near my office, and he got straight to the point. I owe you an explanation. I waited. He admitted that he had known Judith was using some of the money I sent to help Natalie. He knew the money was coming from me, and he knew Mom had never told me where all of it was going. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He looked down at the table. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I confronted your mother. He explained that Judith became defensive whenever Natalie was involved, so he decided that staying quiet was easier. I thought I was keeping the peace, he said. You were keeping yourself out of it, I replied. He nodded. You're right. I needed him to admit that he had known and chosen not to act. He did. After that, things with my parents settled into an uncomfortable routine. Judith wasn't suddenly remorseful. She never called to say she had been a terrible mother or asked me to forget what happened. When we spoke, she still said things like, I did what I thought was best. And, you don't understand what a mother worries about. I stopped trying to convince her that my side was the only one that mattered. She could believe she had protected Natalie. I could believe she had crossed a line with me. Both things could exist at the same time. Derek and I went back to our normal life. Work became busier, and a project I had spent months building finally moved into its next stage. My manager asked me to lead the rollout, which meant more responsibility and a raise. It wasn't some dramatic victory, but it was something I had earned through my own work. For once, my first thought wasn't whether Mom would be impressed. I was simply proud of myself. One evening, Derek asked whether I wanted to tell my parents about the promotion. I thought about it, then shook my head. Not yet. He nodded and changed the subject. That small decision stayed with me. For most of my life, I had measured myself through my mother's reactions. When she praised Natalie, I wondered what was wrong with me. When she criticized me, I looked for ways to prove her wrong. When she approved of something I did, I treated it as evidence that I had finally earned my place. I didn't want to live that way anymore. Natalie eventually found part-time work while continuing to search for something permanent. She cut back on expenses and handled her own payments. I didn't monitor her progress or ask whether she was struggling. If she needed advice, she could ask. If she needed money, that was no longer something she could assume would come from me. I never told our relatives what had happened. I didn't post about it, and I never tried to embarrass Natalie. There was nothing I wanted from exposing the family. I had already said what needed to be said. The boundary was enough. My parents remained part of my life, but the relationship changed. I still answered Dad's calls. I still spoke to Mom when she reached out. I just stopped confusing family loyalty with unlimited access to my time, money, and choices. One Saturday morning, I was getting ready for work when I thought about the dinner where everything had started. At the time, I had wanted my mother to see me differently. I wanted her to recognize that I had built a good life, even if it didn't look like Natalie's. Now I understood that I had been waiting for permission I didn't need. My career was mine. My marriage was mine. My home was mine. The decisions I made about my money were mine too. Judith might never call me successful, and I no longer needed her to. The value of my life was not something she could give me or take away. I had spent years trying to earn a place at a table where I should never have had to prove I belonged. In the end, I didn't leave the family. I simply stopped abandoning myself to keep everyone else comfortable. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your own boundaries, tell me where you're watching from. I read the comments, and I'd like to hear your story.